Hey beautiful, have you considered subscribing to our channel? Help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers.
It started with the crunch of gravel under tires, a sound that didn't belong. The morning had been quiet until then. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden shafts across my freshly mowed lawn. I had just settled into the porch, swing, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, breathing in the cool, pine-scented air that I had paid dearly to enjoy. 6 months into owning this house, and it still felt like paradise. That is, until she arrived. A white SUV rolled to a sharp stop at the edge of my driveway. The driver's door flung open, and out stepped a woman with the self-importance of royalty and the urgency of a fire inspector. Clipboard tucked beneath her arm, mirrored sunglasses hiding eyes I could already feel judging me, she marched across my grass with a determined fury that could rival a SWAT raid. She didn't knock. She didn't smile. She simply slapped a bright, yellow envelope onto the wooden rail of my porch and turned as if the conversation was already over. "Excuse me?" I called, stepping forward. "Can I help you?" She froze, pivoted with military precision, and gave me a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Violation notice," she said crisply. "You've been cited for improper trash bin, storage, lawn height exceeding neighborhood guidelines, and unauthorized garden decor." I blinked, thrown. "I'm sorry. Who are you?" "Karen Pendleton," she announced as if the name should be engraved on a marble plaque. "President of the Evergreen Hills Homeowners Association." Evergreen Hills was the neighborhood, too, blocks over, a collection of nearly identical beige homes with manicured hedges and matching mailboxes. I didn't live in Evergreen Hills. My house, a charming fixer-upper with a wide yard and actual character, was just outside the invisible line that marked the HOA's boundary. That detail had been part of the appeal when I bought the place. "There must be some mistake," I said, polite but firm. "This property isn't part of Evergreen Hills. I'm not under the HOA." Karen arched an eyebrow, flipping through a packet of papers as if consulting divine scripture. "Every house in this area abides by the HOA regulations. We maintain the community standard." I gestured toward the narrow stretch of woodland that separated my lot from her neighborhood. "I'm outside your jurisdiction. This house was built in the 70s, long before the HOA was even formed. It's not under your rules." Her lips curled into a condescending smile. "That's what the last guy said. He changed his tune once. The fines started adding up." She turned without waiting for another word and stalked back to her car. The gravel crunched again, and just like that she was gone. I stood frozen, yellow envelope in hand, heart pounding not with fear but with something more electric, disbelief laced with irritation. I wasn't someone who liked conflict. I'd chosen this house for peace, but something told me this woman didn't care about property lines or legal jurisdiction. Back inside, I spread the envelope's contents on the kitchen table like evidence, in a crime drama. Photos, zoomed-in shots of my gnome statue, my trash bins tucked beside the garage, a measuring tape awkwardly angled against my lawn, printed citations. A letter threatening escalating fines and liens if the violations were not addressed. I pulled out my property documents, the original plat map, the deed, everything that made it crystal clear. I was not, had never been, and legally could not be part of Evergreen Hills HOA. I highlighted the key parts, made copies, and walked them over to her office the next morning. The HOA office turned out to be a glorified, converted garage at the edge of her neighborhood, flanked by shrubs, trimmed to resemble swans. She was waiting at a folding table, sipping from a monogrammed tumbler and scrolling her phone with one manicured finger. "I brought proof," I said, placing the papers gently on the table. "I'm not part of your HOA. You need to stop leaving. Notice is on my door." Karen didn't look up. "I don't take property advice from people who can't even store their trash cans correctly." "They're beside my garage," I said slowly, "on my land, that you have no right to be on." She gave me a pitying look. I'm enforcing standards. Your behavior affects property values in this area. I stared at her, flabbergasted. You can't fine people for existing outside your imaginary kingdom. Oh, but I can, she said sweetly, rising from her chair with the same smug energy that made small dogs bark at nothing. The community supports me. We all want the same thing, a clean, compliant, rule-following neighborhood. You can either be part of the solution or be removed. I wasn't sure what that even meant, but I knew then that this wasn't going to end with a polite chat over boundary lines. Over the next week, the notices kept coming. Different color envelopes this time. Red, blue, orange. One taped to my garage door, another zip-tied to my mailbox. She left one in a plastic sleeve stapled to a tree in my front yard. Neighbors began looking at me differently, like I was the kid who didn't wear a uniform to school. One morning, a soft knock came at my back door. An older man I vaguely recognized from a few houses down. Nervous, he glanced over his shoulder before speaking. "She's done this before," he whispered. "Gave my wife hell over planting sunflowers. Claimed they were an unauthorized species." I didn't say anything back then, but "You're not alone," I nodded, grateful. "Why don't people push back?" He shrugged, eyes haunted. "Because she makes life hell when you do." He walked off before I could ask more. That night I installed cameras, one on the porch, one by the driveway, and a motion-activated light out back. I wasn't going to be caught off guard again. The next time she came around, I'd have proof. Not that it mattered to her, but I had a feeling this was going to escalate. Karen Pendleton didn't strike me as the type to back down. As I sat, in the dim glow of my living room, watching the footage loop from earlier that day, her smug face peering through my hedges, clipboard in hand, I realized this wasn't just about trash cans or garden gnomes. This was war. And Karen didn't know it yet, but she had just picked a fight with someone who knew how to end one. I hadn't even realized how much Karen's presence had wormed its way under my skin until the next time I stepped outside to grab the mail. Another envelope. Another warning. This one had a final notice sticker slapped across the front, as if I had somehow missed the previous 5 letters, each more ridiculous than the last. The thing about a neighborhood like mine, one where the homes were spread out enough to give the illusion of privacy, was that there wasn't much that went unnoticed. My neighbors, though friendly, were wary of rocking the boat. Most of them kept to themselves, their lawns perfectly groomed, their hedges trimmed to precisely the same height as the one next door. They wore their HOA compliance like a badge of honor, but I could tell they weren't completely comfortable with the little empire Karen had built. Karen didn't just stay within the boundaries of her neighborhood. She had a way of stretching, her influence, like a spider spinning her web. One evening, I came home from work to find her standing by my mailbox, clipboard in hand, scrutinizing my yard as if I'd invited her. "Are you serious?" I called out from the driveway. "You can't just walk up to my house whenever you feel like it." She didn't flinch. "You didn't trim your hedges last week," she said, flipping through her clipboard with the same rhythm like she'd rehearsed this line 1,000 times. "And that car, you know it's supposed to be parked in the garage overnight." I clenched my fists. "It's my property, Karen, not yours. I don't care about your rules." Her eyes narrowed, but her voice stayed sweet, dripping with condescension. "You'll care when the fines start adding up, and you'll care when your neighbors start complaining about the way your property is dragging down the entire block's appearance." I felt my pulse quicken. "What does it take for you to leave me alone?" She glanced over her shoulder, noting the neighbors who had begun to peek out from behind their curtains. "You're starting to make the community uncomfortable, and I'm here to ensure we all follow the rules. That's what a leader does, you know." With that, she turned and walked back to her car, but not before giving one last, lingering look at my house, her gaze sharp, calculating. I couldn't help but feel trapped. But it wasn't the fines or the rules that bothered me as much as the way she manipulated everyone around her. The neighbors, the ones who didn't even care about the HOA's petty details, were terrified of her. They had been broken down into submission by this woman, whose rule was as invisible as it was oppressive. I decided to push back, gently at first, but with the intention of making her realize I wasn't going to be the next name on her list of victims. I spent the next few days researching everything I could about the HOA. I dug through old city records, finding out when the HOA had been established, where its boundaries were drawn, and most importantly, where my property stood in relation to its grasp. It turned out that Karen had no legal claim over my land, at least not the way she seemed to think she did. It was then that I realized just how much power she thought she had. She wasn't just a neighbor with too much time on her hands. She was a tyrant who had managed to make a number of people feel that they had no choice but to obey her whims. And she was about to meet someone who didn't follow orders. The next day, I put my findings to use. Armed with copies of my deed and the official map of the neighborhood's HOA boundary, I walked back to the little converted garage that served as her office. I arrived just after lunch, when most people were at work or avoiding the heat. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered overhead, giving the place an almost sinister feel. There were stacks of paperwork everywhere, binders crammed with rules, regulations, and self-righteous declarations. Karen herself was seated at a folding table, chewing on something, her ever-present clipboard perched beside her. "I'm here to discuss the notices you've been leaving on my property," I said, setting the stack of papers down between us. "I've checked, and you have no legal authority to fine me or enforce your rules on my land." Her eyes flicked up, but there was no surprise, just that same smug, all-knowing look she gave everyone who tried to argue with her. "I'm aware of your little loophole," she said, her voice dismissive. "But we all know that rules are rules, and those rules apply to everyone, whether they like it or not." I leaned in closer, trying not to let my frustration show. "You don't get to decide which rules apply to me, Karen. The HOA's rules only apply to people who are part of it, and I'm not." She shrugged, as if my argument was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "You'll learn soon enough that we make the rules around here. You can resist, but in the end, we always win." I forced a smile. "That's where you're wrong. I didn't leave her office that day with the outcome I had hoped for, but I left with a plan, one that would eventually make her realize that her position of power was not as secure as she thought. I began documenting everything: photographs of her inspections, recordings of her aggressive phone calls, and videos of her trespassing across my property. I knew I couldn't let her continue to invade my space without consequences. As the days passed, I realized something else. Karen was starting to make mistakes. She was growing bolder, assuming that I would just roll over like the others. But I wasn't going to let her have the last word. It wasn't just about the fines or the threats anymore. It was about standing up for myself and making sure she couldn't control my life any longer. What I didn't expect was how quickly things would escalate. Just as I was setting up my next move, I found myself face-to-face with Karen once more, this time in a much more intimate confrontation, and this time I wasn't the one who would be backed into a corner. The confrontation came when I least expected it. I had just finished installing a new security camera on the back of my garage when I heard the unmistakable sound of gravel crunching under tires. My stomach sank before I even looked out the window. There it was, the white SUV parked in front of my yard again, a little too close to the curb. I'd been waiting for it, but I had hoped the escalating tension between us might fizzle out. Clearly, I was wrong. I didn't need to check the time to know that it was already past 8, too late for a casual visit. My heart pounded in my chest as I slipped on my shoes, already imagining the threats she would throw at me. Karen had a way of making everything feel urgent, like you were always on the verge of being in trouble. But this time, I wasn't going to back down. I walked outside to meet her, each step deliberate, forcing myself to remain calm, even though my blood was boiling. As I approached, Karen was already stepping out of her SUV, clipboard in hand, her expression as cold and impersonal as ever. She didn't look surprised to see me standing there. She probably expected me to cave in long ago. "Good evening," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's this about?" She didn't greet me. She didn't even acknowledge the question. Instead, she glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the yard with that same critical eye. "You've once again failed to meet the standards of the HOA," she said flatly, not even bothering to look me in the face as she spoke. "Your driveway is cluttered, your lawn needs trimming, your garbage bins are still not placed where they should be." I held up my hand to stop her. "Karen, I've had enough of these threats. You know very well that you have no authority over my property. I'm not part of your HOA." She stiffened, but only for a moment. "You might not be part of the HOA, but you're still part of the community," she said with that superior tone, as though her words were somehow irrefutable. "And you're damaging the integrity of this neighborhood with your disregard for rules. The rest of the residents don't appreciate it." I clenched my fists at my sides, trying not to let her taunt me. "You're right about one thing. I'm damaging the neighborhood. But not in the way you think. You're the one causing all the trouble by harassing me and my neighbors. You think you can control everyone with your ridiculous fines and threats." Her lips curled into a tight, self-satisfied smile. "I'm not the problem here, you are. If you'd just follow the rules like everyone else, we wouldn't be having this conversation." I couldn't help but laugh, though it was laced with bitterness. "You really think I'm the problem?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "You've been crossing boundaries, Karen. You've been trespassing on my property, leaving fines and warnings. I've given you every chance to back off, but instead, you keep pushing." Karen didn't react to the accusation. She simply tapped her clipboard, as if the papers on it held the answer to everything. "You don't understand," she said, her tone colder now. "I'm doing what's necessary, and you will follow the rules." That's when something clicked inside me. The realization hit harder than I expected. She wasn't just about enforcing rules. This wasn't about trash cans or lawn care anymore. It was about power. She wanted control, and I was the one standing in the way of her little kingdom. I narrowed my eyes, meeting her gaze squarely. "I'm not scared of you, Karen, and I'm done letting you think you can bully me into submission." Her expression didn't change, but something in her demeanor shifted, like she was sizing me up. For a split second, I saw something behind her eyes, a crack in her facade. It was subtle, but it was there. She wasn't as confident as she wanted me to believe. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," she muttered under her breath, though her voice was tinged with an edge of frustration I hadn't heard before. I stepped closer, knowing full well that my next words would determine the course of this confrontation. "No, Karen, I think it's you who doesn't understand. You've picked the wrong fight, and now you're going to learn what happens when you mess with someone who's not afraid of you." She stiffened at my words, and for a moment, I could almost see the wheels turning in her mind as she realized I wasn't backing down. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," she said, but the threat was less certain now, as if she could feel the tables starting to turn. I took a deep breath, letting the tension between us stretch just long enough to make her uncomfortable. "You've crossed a line," I said calmly, my voice low. "I've already started documenting everything, all your violations, all the times you've trespassed, all the lies you've told my neighbors. You've been playing a dangerous game, and it's about to backfire." The silence between us stretched out, heavier than before. Karen's eyes flicked to the side where the neighbors were starting to gather behind their windows, no doubt curious about the latest drama in the street. Her power was always about perception. how others saw her. But now she was losing that control, and it was starting to show. "I suggest you leave," I said softly, but with steel in my tone. "Before you make this worse for yourself." The first time, Karen hesitated. She glanced around at the gathering eyes, perhaps realizing that her reputation was beginning to slip. She couldn't rely on the isolation she had cultivated anymore. With a final seething look at me, Karen climbed back into her SUV, the engine roaring to life. She didn't slam the door, but I could hear the subtle shake in her hands as she gripped the steering wheel. The vehicle sped off, kicking up a cloud of dust in her wake. I didn't know if this would be the end of it, but I could feel a shift in the air. Something had changed. As I stood there, watching her leave, I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to let her intimidate me anymore, and the next time she came around, I'd be ready. The following weeks were a strange mixture of tension and quiet. Karen didn't come back, but I could feel the weight of her absence, as though the calm was only temporary. I continued to document every move, just in case she thought about pulling. Some new stunt. But I also knew something else. She wasn't the type to back down for long. If anything, my resistance had likely sparked her need for retribution. And then, one morning, I saw the email. I hadn't expected Karen to come at me directly, not after everything that had happened. But there it was, in my inbox, a legal threat. The HOA, now backing her play, had decided to take me to court over the so-called violations. They were pushing for a massive fine, the sort of penalty that could cripple anyone who wasn't prepared. It was their final move, the one they thought would scare me into submission. But I wasn't scared. If anything, I felt more determined than ever. I knew that this was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment when the real fight began. Karen had underestimated me, and now she was going to pay for it. I set to work immediately. The first thing I did was reach out to a lawyer, one who specialized in property disputes and dealing with overreaching HOAs. I needed someone who knew the ins and outs of the system, someone who could fight back. The lawyer was more than willing to take the case, especially when I explained just how relentless Karen had been. We began to build a case, pulling together every bit of evidence I had, every photograph, every video, every witness statement. I started digging into Karen's past, too, looking for anything that might discredit her. It wasn't just about the fines anymore. It was about taking down the whole system she had built, exposing the ugly truth about her manipulation and power-hungry ways. The days stretched on as we prepared. Every time I thought about Karen, I imagined her smug face, the way she carried herself like she had the world under her thumb. But I knew something she didn't. She was vulnerable. Her greatest strength had always been her ability to control perception, to make people believe she was infallible. But now that illusion was about to crumble. The court date arrived faster than I expected, and I found myself standing at the entrance of the courthouse, the weight of everything pressing on my shoulders. Karen's SUV was already parked outside, and I could see her through the glass doors, sitting at her lawyer's side, talking in low, clipped tones. She looked confident, too confident, as if she knew the outcome was already decided. But that was the thing about Karen. She didn't understand the full scope of what she had started. She thought she could bully me, throw her weight around, and I'd simply fold. She thought her connections would shield her from any real consequences. But what she didn't realize was that her entire power structure was built on a foundation of fear. And fear? Fear could be shattered. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The judge was a no-nonsense type, someone who wasn't interested in drama or sideshows. As the proceedings began, Karen's lawyer wasted no time in presenting their case. How I was an outlier, how my refusal to comply with the HOA rules was a threat to the integrity of the neighborhood. But every word they spoke felt hollow, like they were trying to sell a story that didn't quite hold up under scrutiny. When it was my turn, I stood, calm and collected, presenting my evidence. I showed the photos, the recordings, and the written documentation. I outlined how Karen had been harassing me, how she had no legal right to fine me, and how her actions were motivated by a desire for control, not community welfare. I could see Karen's face shift as she sat there, trying to maintain her composure, but the cracks were starting to show. The more I spoke, the more uncomfortable she seemed. But it wasn't just the legal evidence that mattered. It was the truth I was exposing. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for every person in that neighborhood who had been silenced by Karen's oppressive rule. And in that courtroom, I could feel it. A shift in the air. The tide was turning. The final blow came when I presented my trump card. Video footage of Karen trespassing on my property, caught red-handed, leaving fines on my doorstep when she had no legal right to do so. It was the moment that sealed her fate. The judge's eyes narrowed as he reviewed the footage, and I could see Karen's confidence crack. "What is this?" the judge asked, his voice cold. Karen's lawyer stammered, trying to deflect. "This is an obvious misunderstanding. The HOA, not a misunderstanding," I interrupted, my voice steady. "This is evidence of trespassing, of harassment. This isn't a dispute over property values or lawn care. This is about abuse of power." Karen's face drained of color. She shot a glance at her lawyer, but it was clear there was no escaping this now. The courtroom was silent, and I could feel every pair of eyes on us. The humiliation was palpable. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor. The case was dismissed, and Karen was ordered to pay restitution for the harassment and legal fees I had incurred. But the real victory was in the aftermath. The neighbors, the ones who had been too afraid to speak out, started to come forward. One by one, they shared their own stories. How Karen had tried to control their lives, how she had used the HOA as a weapon to manipulate and silence anyone who didn't fall in line. And then, just as the final blow was struck, a viral video of Karen's downfall began to circulate. I had sent it to a few people, and somehow it made its way to social media, where it quickly gained traction. The footage of her humiliating defeat spread like wildfire, and within hours, Karen's reign of terror was over. Neighbors who had once cowered now laughed at her expense. As for me, I walked away victorious. My property was mine again, and Karen's power had been exposed for the farce it was. The HOA lost its grip on the neighborhood, and the community, once paralyzed by fear, began to heal. But as I sat back and watched the fallout, I couldn't help but smile. I had stood my ground, and in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.